Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Question to the Premier. Where are the records from the Premier's office of Robert Giz currently stored?
Okay.
The Honourable Premier.
Where is the shoebox?
They're with the Public Archives, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Premier. The Honourable Member, Georgetown St. Peters.
Thank you. I'm assuming it includes a bunch of emails that we're looking for. Question again to the Premier. Who was responsible for records management in the Premier's office under Robert Giz?
Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, we had a very diligent person responsible for records and correspondence who continued to serve into my time as Premier, Mr. Speaker, who served the province for the better part of 30 years, and I'm very proud of the good work that she did, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Premier. The Honourable Member, Georgetown St. Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Archives and Records Act sets out a public records committee that has to approve records management practices and record deletions. Question again to the Premier. Will you confirm that Melissa McCachran and Doug Clough were serving on this committee at the time of the e-gaming scandal?
The Honourable Minister of Education, Early Learning and Culture.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And certainly, as I've shared in the House, we'll certainly have taken questions in advisement. I've asked today, again, that I'd like to have that information, to bring that information forward in respect to the questions that I've taken on advisement. Mr. Speaker, I'm certainly very pleased with the update I received this morning in response to the recommendations from the Auditor General's report. And as the Minister who's been at these tables for almost 10 years, Mr. Speaker, I take the recommendations and the work and have great respect for the Office of the Auditor General, and we look forward to bringing forward a record information management strategy for the next 5 years to modernize electronic health records and policies and procedures into the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Honourable Member, Georgetown St. Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And unfortunately, the Auditor General's office is one of the very few offices of the government that's actually still respected, and that's because of you guys and some of the things that you pulled on Islanders over the years. It was Melissa McCachran and Doug Clough both said on this committee, so I'll answer the question. It was yes. And I'll go back to the Premier again. Premier, will you agree with the Auditor General and myself that these senior officials were also at the heart of the ongoing e-gaming scandal and cover-up?
Honourable Minister of Education, Early Learning and Culture.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and certainly I do want to add that we will be bringing forward, and I've had numerous conversations and questions in the Assembly, and have committed to taking information and questions in advisement. And certainly I'm very pleased that getting briefings this morning on the strategy, and I must say that email protocols have been upgraded, Mr. Speaker. The new email protocols were introduced in July of 2016 to ensure compliance with the Act, and certainly coming this spring, certainly as the Minister responsible for records information management, I take that responsibility very seriously as we provide oversight for all record management and policies and procedures all across government and government departments, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Honourable Member, Georgetown St. Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And it's great to hear from the Minister of Education on this file. I wish that the Premier would stop shirking his responsibility to his portfolio, which is the Premier Prince Edward Island, which is the top of all this, and it's where all the trouble started with this file, and it's where all the trouble continues to be, and it's you're hiding from it. The Minister is right, but there was also a document that outlined how to handle emails in 2007. You remember it very well. Question to the Premier. Are you familiar with the government guidelines that have been in place since 2007 with reference to government emails?
Honourable Minister of Education, Early Learning and Culture.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And certainly what I do know is the path forward in respect to the recommendations. And certainly I'm very pleased at having the responsibility to modernize record information management. As the Minister responsible for the provincial archives and records responsibilities, as I indicated, We're currently doing assessments. Those assessments we're presenting to myself as the minister that I will be tabling in this assembly to make sure that all government departments are meeting their responsibilities and compliances to make sure that the policies and protocols are being held, and we'll be taking that work very seriously, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Honourable Member, Georgetown St. Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So these guidelines state that email records must be scheduled and retained for the appropriate period of time. Question to the Premier. How long were these senior officials' emails supposed to be kept for?
Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, on the question that the honourable member asked about my familiarity with the regime for looking after official records, within the first week or 10 days of becoming Premier, I had a meeting with the public archivist, Jill McMicken-Wilson, who was responsible for that area, and was given a complete briefing on the regime and the protocols regarding official records, and a very competent staff that works with me to ensure that in the Premier's office those records are well looked after. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Premier. The Honourable Member for Georgetown St. Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Question again to the Premier. Why is there no records officer listed in your office?
Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I'll look into that and come back to the House. I assume that that had to do with the retirement mid-summer of the person who has done that job for the better part of 3 decades, but I can assure you, Mr. Speaker, that someone has the active responsibility for that on a daily basis. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Premier. Honourable Member, Georgetown St. Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So this government's guidelines, the ones that they come up with themselves, point out that the Archives and Record Act states that government records cannot be destroyed or permanently removed from government custody without the development of records retention and deposition schedules. Question to the Premier. How many records retention and deposition schedules have been approved by the Premier's office since 2008?
Honourable Premier.
I'll have to get back to the House, and I'll be glad to do so. Take that under advisement, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Premier. Honourable Member, Georgetown St. Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So these guidelines also say that absence of these schedules, a one-time destruction order approved in writing by the Public Records Committee is needed to approve the destruction of government records. Question again to the Premier. Will you table the destruction order for the deleted emails that are referenced in the Auditor General's report?
Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I'll have to see if there is such a record in the first place, and I'll get back to the House on that, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Premier. Honourable Member, Georgetown St. Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, the Premier would save himself an awful lot of time and effort on this e-gaming file if he would stop trying to, number one, cover it up, and number two, pretend like he doesn't know things, except for when he wants to pretend like he knows things. You know that there's no, you know for a fact that there's not. Will you tell this House today, once and for all, whose email accounts were deleted?
Honourable Minister of Education, Early Learning and Culture.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I did indicate to the member once again from Georgetown St. Peters that I've asked staff to bring that information forward, and once I receive that, I'll bring that forward. But certainly, Mr. Speaker, I just want to let the Assembly know that we have a strategy that's in place. I'm looking forward to bringing that strategy forward. I have the responsibility under the legislation, which falls inside the Department of Education, Early Learning and Culture, to provide oversight and make sure that the compliance and the training and the assessments of proper modern record management is in place, Mr. Speaker. I take that responsibility very seriously as the Minister, and I'll continue to work at implementing that strategy to the best of my capabilities. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Honourable Member, Georgetown St. Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Question to the Premier. You don't have to tell us who, but can you tell this House, do you know whose emails were deleted?
Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister responsible for Public Archives and Records has indicated on a number of days now that this matter would be looked into, taken under advisement, and bring this back to the House. And Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, the question is, do I know? There's a minister responsible who has said he would take that under advisement and bring it back. So, Mr. Speaker, I take the minister at his word, and I, like other members of the House, look forward to that answer. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Premier. Honourable Member, Georgetown St. Peter's, final question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Premier of Prince Edward Island is making a mockery of this House. He's making a mockery of this House by not answering the simplest of question, Mr. Speaker. The question I asked was whether or not he knew. I didn't ask him to tell the House. I didn't ask for a song and dance. I didn't ask for him to tell me the Education Minister was going to bring it back on some phantom date. I asked him if he knew who it was. Mr. Premier, will you stop making a mockery of this House today and answer a simple question? Do you know whose email accounts were deleted?
Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I'd have to say the member opposite makes a mockery of question period when he's gotten an answer on numerous occasions that the minister will bring back the answer. And Mr. Speaker, the minister will bring back an answer that I expect will be very complicated. And no, I don't know the answer to the question. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Premier.